Narcissists don't argue to understand, they argue to dominate. The goal is not clarity, it's control. That's why logic alone rarely works. You can be accurate, articulate, and prepared, and still walk away confused. Not because you were wrong, but because the game was never about truth in the first place. Most people try to win these interactions by explaining more. They bring evidence, emotion, and reasoning into the conversation, believing that clarity will eventually land. But narcissistic dynamics don't reward clarity, they reward reaction. The moment you become emotionally invested in being understood, the balance of power shifts away from you. The one thing narcissists cannot argue with is emotional neutrality paired with consistency. Not facts alone, but calm, steady, unchanging behavior. Emotional neutrality removes the fuel. Narcissistic patterns depend on intensity. They provoke, minimize, deflect, or inflate situations to pull you into reaction. Reaction gives them something to work with. Calm gives them nothing. When you respond without visible emotion, something important happens. The conversation loses momentum. The tactics stop landing. Provocations don't escalate. The usual push and pull dissolves. And without that friction, their strategy has nowhere to go. Consistency is the second half of what makes this unarguable. Narcissistic behavior relies on testing. They say something one way today and another way tomorrow. They push limits to see what changes. When your response remains the same, calm, brief, and predictable, the testing stops working. They can argue words. They can twist explanations. They can attack tone. But they cannot argue with a pattern that doesn't move. Facts delivered emotionally invite debate. Facts delivered calmly and repeatedly end it. You don't need to prove your point. You let time and repetition do that for you. When your position doesn't shift, the argument collapses on its own. Another reason this works is that emotional neutrality prevents role reversal. Narcissistic conversations often flip responsibility. You start defending instead of observing. You start explaining instead of choosing. Calm consistency stops that flip. You remain in control of your behavior, regardless of their response. This approach also protects your self-respect. You stop performing. You stop persuading. You stop hoping for validation. Instead, you decide how you will show up and you stick to it. That decision alone changes the dynamic. Some people mistake this for indifference. It's not. It's discipline. It's the ability to stay regulated while someone else tries to destabilize the interaction. That regulation communicates strength faster than any argument ever could. Over time, narcissists respond in one of two ways. They adjust because the old tactics no longer work, or they disengage because there is nothing left to extract. Both outcomes are clarity. This does not require confrontation. It does not require exposure. It does not require winning. It requires restraint, and restraint is what narcissistic patterns cannot manipulate. The mistake most people make is believing they need the other person to admit wrongdoing. They don't. They need the behavior to stop affecting them. Emotional neutrality with consistency achieves that without a fight. When you stop feeding the pattern weakens. When you stop reacting, control shifts. And when your behavior stays calm and predictable, there is nothing left to argue with. That is the one thing narcissists can't defeat. Not because it overpowers them, but because it quietly removes the game altogether. Narcissists thrive on reaction, not resolution, and this distinction explains why interactions with them so often feel exhausting, circular, and unproductive. In healthy communication, disagreement moves toward clarity, compromise, or closure. With narcissistic personalities, disagreement is rarely about solving anything. It is about generating emotional energy. Reaction is the currency they seek because reaction confirms influence. When someone reacts defensively, emotionally, angrily, or even passionately, it signals that the narcissist has successfully occupied mental and emotional space. Resolution, on the other hand, would end the exchange, remove attention, and restore balance, which offers them nothing. Reaction feeds their sense of importance. Narcissistic dynamics are built on the need to feel significant, superior, or central. Emotional responses from others serve as proof that they matter. Whether the reaction is positive or negative is irrelevant. Admiration and frustration both satisfy the same need. This is why logical explanations, heartfelt appeals, or calm attempts at mutual understanding often fail. These efforts assume the other person values clarity and fairness. Narcissists value stimulation and control. They prolong conflict not because the issue is complex, but because the emotional engagement itself is rewarding. Resolution threatens their leverage. When a problem is resolved, boundaries become clear, expectations stabilize, and emotional volatility decreases. That stability removes opportunities to provoke, shift blame, or rewrite narratives. Narcissists often unconsciously resist resolution by changing the subject, reframing the issue, denying previous statements, or escalating emotionally. Each tactic reopens the loop and invites renewed reaction. The discussion never settles because settlement would mean losing influence over the emotional direction of the interaction. Reaction also provides data. By provoking responses, narcissists learn what triggers you, what you fear, and what you value. Every emotional reaction becomes information they can later use to manipulate outcomes. Anger shows where you feel powerless. Defensiveness reveals insecurity. Over-explaining exposes a need for validation. This is why arguments with narcissists often feel strangely intimate and invasive. They are not exchanging ideas. They are mapping vulnerabilities. Resolution would cut off this information flow. Another reason narcissists prioritize reaction is that it allows them to avoid accountability. Emotional chaos distracts from facts. When emotions run high, details blur, timelines distort, and responsibility becomes harder to pin down. Narcissists exploit this by escalating tension whenever accountability approaches. The moment the conversation threatens to become concrete, it is derailed into tone policing, personal attacks, or dramatic claims. The focus shifts from what happened to how everyone feels, and the original issue disappears. Reaction becomes the smokescreen that protects them from consequence. People often respond by trying harder to be understood. They clarify, justify, explain, and repeat themselves with increasing intensity. This effort feels reasonable, but it unintentionally strengthens the pattern. The more you invest emotionally in being understood, the more reaction you provide. The narcissist senses this investment and continues to withhold resolution. Because the emotional payoff is growing, what feels like persistence on your part feels like power on theirs. Calmness disrupts the cycle because it removes the reward. When responses are measured, brief, and emotionally neutral, there is nothing to feed on. Without visible reaction, provocation loses its purpose. The narcissist may escalate at first, increasing intensity to provoke a response, but without reinforcement, the behavior eventually loses momentum. This is not because they suddenly understand your point, but because the interaction no longer serves their needs. Consistency is equally important. A single calm response followed by later emotional engagement resets the pattern. Narcissistic dynamics rely on unpredictability. They test to see when and how reactions appear. When your behavior remains steady regardless of their tactics, the emotional economy collapses. There is no surge of energy to harvest, no new angle to exploit. Resolution may still not occur, but the impact on you diminishes, which is often the more meaningful outcome. Understanding that narcissists thrive on reaction rather than resolution shifts your goal. The aim is no longer to convince, correct, or change them. The aim becomes protecting your emotional clarity. When you stop seeking resolution from someone who does not value it, you regain control over your participation. You choose when to engage, how much to share, and when to disengage. This choice quietly dismantles the power imbalance. The most difficult part of this shift is accepting that fairness is not the shared objective. Many people remain stuck because they believe that if they just communicate better, resolution will happen. But communication cannot produce resolution where resolution is not desired. Once this reality is accepted, reactions soften, expectations adjust, and emotional energy is conserved. The narcissist may continue attempting to provoke, but without reaction, those attempts lose significance, and the interaction gradually changes shape. Emotional neutrality removes their advantage because it disrupts the very mechanism that gives manipulative or narcissistic behavior its power. People who seek control through dominance, gaslighting, or intimidation rely on emotional engagement to steer interactions in their favor. They do not win by being right. They win by getting you emotionally involved. Once emotions enter the conversation, logic weakens, boundaries blur, and self-control becomes harder to maintain. Emotional neutrality shuts down this pathway entirely, leaving nothing for manipulation to attach itself to. Emotional reactions create leverage. When you show anger, frustration, hurt, or defensiveness, you are revealing where you are invested. That investment becomes a handle others can grab. A raised voice, a rushed explanation, or an attempt to prove yourself signals that the interaction matters more to you than it does to them. This imbalance is precisely what manipulative individuals exploit. Emotional neutrality removes that imbalance by restoring internal authority. When your tone remains calm and your response is measured, the other person loses the ability to steer the exchange through provocation. Neutrality is often misunderstood as passivity, but it is the opposite. It is active self-regulation. You are choosing not to donate emotional energy to a dynamic designed to drain it. This choice requires discipline because the tactics used against you are meant to trigger instinctive responses. Accusations invite defense. Disrespect invites retaliation. Confusion invites over-explaining. Emotional neutrality interrupts these instincts. It creates a pause between stimulus and response, and in that pause, control returns to you. Without emotional fuel, manipulation stalls. Gaslighting, for example, depends on destabilizing your emotional confidence. When someone denies your experience or reframes reality, the goal is not accuracy but self-doubt. Emotional reactions accelerate that doubt by pulling attention away from facts and toward feelings. Neutral responses, such as brief acknowledgments, factual statements, or silence, prevent the distortion from gaining momentum. The manipulator may repeat themselves or escalate, but without emotional reinforcement, their narrative fails to take root. Emotional neutrality also protects clarity. Strong emotions narrow perception. Under stress, the brain prioritizes defense over analysis. This makes it easier for others to redirect conversations, shift blame, or introduce irrelevant issues. When you remain neutral, your thinking stays organized. You notice patterns instead of getting lost in details. You remember what was actually said instead of what was implied. This clarity is threatening to manipulative behavior because it removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is where control hides. Another advantage of emotional neutrality is that it exposes intent. When provocation no longer produces reaction, the other person's behavior becomes more visible. Without your emotional response to mask it, patterns emerge quickly. Repeated boundary violations, circular arguments, or escalating tone reveal that the goal was never mutual understanding. This realization often brings relief. You stop taking the behavior personally and start responding strategically, which further weakens the manipulative dynamic. Neutrality shifts the power dynamic internally. Instead of asking, consciously or unconsciously, how do I get them to stop? The focus becomes, how do I stay steady? This shift is subtle but profound. You stop outsourcing your emotional state to someone else's behavior. When your calm is no longer dependent on their cooperation, their influence diminishes. They may continue attempting to provoke, but their success no longer determines your stability. Consistency is key. Emotional neutrality works not because it is dramatic, but because it is predictable. Manipulative individuals rely on emotional variability. They test boundaries by pushing harder when they sense weakness and retreating when resistance appears. When your responses remain steady regardless of pressure, the testing loses purpose. There is no reward cycle to reinforce the behavior. Over time, the interaction either becomes more respectful or less frequent, both of which serve your well-being. It is important to recognize that emotional neutrality does not guarantee cooperation or change. Some individuals will never adjust their behavior. The value of neutrality lies not in reforming others, but in protecting yourself. By remaining neutral, you conserve emotional energy, maintain self-respect, and prevent escalation. You also make clear decisions about distance, boundaries, or disengagement because those decisions are not clouded by emotional exhaustion. Choosing emotional neutrality is choosing self-leadership. It is the decision to respond from values rather than impulses, from clarity rather than chaos. When emotions no longer dictate your responses, manipulation loses its grip. The advantage shifts quietly but decisively back to you, not because you overpowered the other person, but because you refuse to be pulled into a game that was never meant to be fair. Facts without emotion end circular arguments because they remove the fuel that keeps the cycle going. Most people misunderstand arguments with manipulative or narcissistic individuals because they try to win through persuasion, emotion, or debate. The problem is that in these dynamics, logic is rarely the goal, and emotional intensity is the method. Circular arguments exist because the other party is not seeking truth, they are seeking engagement. Every emotional reaction reinforces the cycle, giving momentum to statements, accusations, and distortions. When you present facts calmly without attachment or defensiveness, the argument loses its energy and often collapses on its own. Circular arguments are designed to create confusion, self-doubt, and fatigue. Dominant or manipulative personalities rely on inconsistencies in your reasoning, emotional spikes, or repeated attempts to justify yourself. They push you to over-explain, repeat, and justify, knowing that each effort chips away at clarity. When emotions enter the conversation, your perception narrows. You respond reactively rather than rationally, which strengthens the circular loop. Facts delivered without emotion remove this leverage. They anchor the conversation in observable reality rather than subjective reaction. Facts alone cannot be argued with indefinitely because they are measurable. They do not bend under pressure, and they do not require validation through approval or acceptance. When presented consistently and calmly, they serve as touch points that resist reinterpretation. You are not debating opinion, interpretation, or perception, you are referencing reality. This distinction frustrates manipulative behavior because it cannot shift, spin, or distort facts in the same way it can with emotional responses. The effectiveness of fact-based communication lies in its predictability. When you rely on emotions, your responses fluctuate depending on mood, fatigue, or stress. Circular arguments thrive on this variability. They test boundaries, repeat claims, and escalate pressure to see how you will react. Facts remove this variable. When you consistently reference observable reality without emotional fluctuation, the pattern of reaction disappears and the manipulator's influence diminishes. Facts without emotion also protect your credibility. Emotional arguments can sound reasonable in the heat of the moment but often backfire when later reviewed. Defensiveness, sarcasm, and frustration distort memory and impression. Calmly stated facts stand independently of tone or delivery. They communicate authority and composure even in the presence of aggressive or dismissive behavior. Over time, consistency and factual clarity builds trust and reduces repeated challenges. Circular arguments often continue because the other person is seeking dominance rather than understanding. They thrive on tension, disagreement, and the unpredictability of responses. Emotional responses fuel the tension. Facts strip it away. By providing information without attachment, you signal that the discussion is not about winning or losing, it is about reality. This removes the incentive for repeated engagement. Because the interaction no longer produces emotional energy that can be exploited, it is also crucial to recognize that facts do not need to be persuasive to be effective. Their power is in their constancy, not their approval. You do not need the other person to accept or acknowledge them. You only need to present them in alignment with your own boundaries and clarity. Circular arguments lose momentum when the manipulative individual realizes that emotional escalation will not elicit a different response. The debate dies not through confrontation but through consistency and calm adherence to reality. Facts without emotion also provide internal clarity. When you anchor yourself in observable truth rather than reactions, you reduce internal confusion. You are less likely to second-guess yourself, apologize unnecessarily, or over-explain. This internal stability reinforces your external behavior. It prevents manipulation from gaining ground by exploiting uncertainty, doubt, or emotional instability. In high-stakes relationships, whether personal, professional, or familial, circular arguments can be draining. They demand energy, attention, and constant recalibration. Facts delivered without emotional attachment conserve energy while maintaining authority. Each repeated attempt by the other party to provoke a different response is met with calm consistency, which slowly reshapes the dynamic. The conversation becomes less about argument and more about observation, which gradually shifts power back to you. Finally, facts without emotion create space for strategic decision-making. When you are not caught in reactive cycles, you can evaluate the situation clearly. You can choose when to engage, when to disengage, and when to enforce boundaries. The manipulation loses its grip because you are operating from a place of clarity rather than reaction. Circular arguments thrive on chaos, but facts delivered without emotion restore order, leaving the manipulator without leverage and the conversation without energy to perpetuate itself. Consistency exposes manipulation faster than confrontation because manipulation thrives on unpredictability. Manipulative individuals rely on irregularity in behavior, tone, or response to create confusion, doubt, and compliance. They push boundaries to test reactions, escalate tensions to elicit concessions, and shift narratives to keep others off balance. Confrontation, while often satisfying in the short term, focuses on proving a point or expressing frustration. It does not address the underlying pattern that manipulation depends upon. Consistency, on the other hand, neutralizes these tactics by removing the element of surprise and expectation, making manipulation visible and ineffective. Manipulation succeeds when reactions are inconsistent. When someone reacts emotionally, hesitates, or over-explains, they provide the manipulator with clues about vulnerabilities and limits. Each reaction is data that the manipulative person can exploit in future interactions. Confrontation is often reactive, driven by the heat of the moment. It can escalate the emotional exchange without providing a stable framework for behavioral boundaries. Consistency, in contrast, relies on predictable, calm, and steady behavior. It communicates that boundaries are non-negotiable and that tactics designed to provoke will fail. Over time, this predictability exposes patterns, making manipulative strategies obvious and ineffective. Consistency also strengthens credibility. A single confrontation may achieve compliance temporarily, but it rarely changes the manipulator's approach long term. They may adjust outwardly in that moment, but if responses fluctuate, the cycle of manipulation resumes. Consistent behavior communicates authority without argument. It signals that you are not swayed by pressure, threats, or provocation. This quiet strength is far more difficult to challenge than a heated verbal confrontation because it removes the emotional fuel that manipulation depends on. Behavioral consistency communicates boundaries more effectively than words alone. Explanations can be debated, emotional confrontations can be twisted or redirected. But actions repeated predictably, calm refusals, steady responses, measured enforcement cannot easily be denied or reframed. When someone repeatedly observes the same behavior in response to similar provocations, they begin to recognize the limits and rules in place. Manipulative tactics become transparent because the manipulator can no longer introduce ambiguity or uncertainty into the exchange. Another critical aspect is that consistency removes personal involvement from manipulation. Confrontation often carries a sense of personal judgment or attack, which may escalate defensiveness on both sides. Manipulative individuals exploit this emotional charge to regain control. Consistent behavior is neutral and principled. It demonstrates adherence to personal standards rather than engagement in a power struggle. This shifts the focus from personal conflict to factual or behavioral reality, leaving the manipulator with no effective leverage. Consistency also allows for emotional regulation. When behavior is steady, the emotional swings that manipulators rely on cannot take hold. Each time a manipulative tactic is attempted, a predictable response prevents the escalation of tension. Over time, manipulative attempts lose their potency because they no longer produce the desired reaction. The manipulator either adjusts strategy or disengages, and the dynamic is fundamentally altered. Confrontation rarely achieves this because it often inflames emotion, creating temporary compliance without long-term clarity. Patterns revealed through consistency also educate observers, including bystanders or third parties. When manipulative behavior is exposed by repeated, steady responses, it becomes apparent to anyone observing. This is particularly important in professional or familial settings where credibility and reputation matter. A confrontation may be dismissed as overreaction or bias, but repeated, consistent behavior provides clear evidence of manipulation independent of personal narrative. Consistency also reduces the mental load of engagement. Manipulative interactions often demand repeated analysis, strategy adjustments, and emotional regulation. Confrontation, while intense, consumes energy without providing a framework for long-term stability. By maintaining consistent behavior, you conserve energy because responses are habitual and principled, not reactive. This internal stability makes manipulation easier to detect and harder to perpetuate. Finally, consistency transforms the power dynamic. Manipulators rely on influencing your behavior to assert dominance. When your responses are consistent, predictable, and principled, you remove that influence. Manipulation loses its impact because it can no longer generate unexpected reactions. Over time, this approach not only protects your autonomy but also demonstrates authority and self-respect without escalating conflict. The manipulator's patterns are exposed naturally, without debate, argument, or confrontation, revealing the structure of their tactics in a way that is both visible and undeniable. Boundaries enforced quietly are unarguable because their power does not rely on debate, persuasion. Many people misunderstand boundaries because they treat them as statements to be justified or explained. They feel compelled to offer reasons, examples, or apologies, believing that understanding will ensure compliance. The problem is that boundaries are not about winning approval. They are about regulating your own space, time, and energy. When boundaries are enforced quietly, through calm, consistent action rather than loud declaration, they communicate clarity without inviting negotiation. There is nothing left to argue with because the boundary exists as a fact, independent of approval or agreement. Quiet enforcement removes the opportunity for manipulation. People who test limits often look for openings in tone, language, or emotional reaction. Loud proclamations, Passionate explanations or defensive language signal uncertainty or emotional investment, which manipulators can exploit. When a boundary is enforced quietly, there is no variability to interpret. The rules are visible in your behavior, not hidden behind words or justifications. This consistency makes it impossible to challenge effectively because the boundary is no longer a matter of opinion, it is reality. Enforcing boundaries quietly also protects emotional energy. Engaging in arguments or explanations consumes attention, fuels emotional escalation, and reinforces reactive patterns. Quiet enforcement requires discipline but conserves energy because the action is simple: align your behavior with your limits and maintain it over time. Each instance of consistent behavior reinforces the boundary without inviting discussion or protest. Over time, people learn that the boundary is non-negotiable, and attempts to challenge it diminish. This approach also models confidence and self-respect. Loud or aggressive enforcement can feel reactive, as though the boundary is a defensive mechanism rather than a considered choice. Quiet enforcement communicates that the boundary is firm because it reflects your values and priorities, not because you are attempting to intimidate, persuade, or justify yourself. That demonstration of authority is difficult to dispute because it is embodied, not argued. Quiet enforcement also prevents escalation. Confrontation often triggers resistance, defensiveness, or manipulation, especially when the boundary is communicated with intensity. Emotions inflame the dynamic, and the focus shifts from the boundary itself to the interpersonal conflict surrounding it. When you enforce boundaries without drama, the manipulative or dominant individual receives no emotional reward from testing or provoking. Without fuel to escalate, the interaction naturally stabilizes. Another advantage of quiet enforcement is that it removes ambiguity. Many failed boundaries occur not because the limits are unclear, but because they are inconsistently applied. If a boundary is articulated verbally but then occasionally ignored, bent, or explained, it becomes negotiable. Quiet enforcement eliminates this uncertainty. The message is clear in your behavior: certain actions, requests, or interactions are acceptable and others are not. This removes the gray area that manipulators exploit. Consistency is crucial to this method. Quiet enforcement requires that every action aligns with the boundary, not just occasional demonstrations. Each time you allow an exception, you undermine the credibility of the boundary. But when enforcement is predictable and reliable, the boundary becomes an observable pattern rather than a suggestion. Others learn quickly what is and is not possible, and attempts to argue against it fade because the outcome is predetermined. Quiet enforcement also aligns with long-term strategy. Loud, confrontational approaches may feel satisfying in the moment but often provoke short-term compliance rather than lasting respect. Quiet enforcement, by contrast, builds sustainable authority. People adapt to your limits gradually and the dynamic shifts without dramatic conflict. Over time, interactions become smoother and your boundaries are respected without constant policing. Importantly, quiet enforcement does not mean passivity. It is not avoidance or appeasement. It is deliberate, active choice expressed through behavior rather than words. Saying nothing does not mean allowing anything. Your actions communicate your limits more clearly than any explanation ever could. In many cases, silent consistency communicates more power than the loudest argument because it cannot be twisted, debated, or dismissed. The manipulative individual may attempt to provoke or question, but the response remains calm, firm, and predictable. This approach also enhances self-trust. Each instance of quietly upholding a boundary reinforces your sense of personal authority. You learn that your limits are valid and forcible, and independent of external validation. This internal reinforcement strengthens resilience, reduces emotional reactivity, and increases the likelihood that you will maintain boundaries in other areas of life. In the end, boundaries enforced quietly are unarguable because they operate outside the realm of opinion, negotiation, and emotional persuasion. They rely on consistency, calmness, and visible alignment between intent and action. By removing the need for justification, reducing opportunities for manipulation, and preserving emotional energy, quiet enforcement ensures that your boundaries are respected not because others agree with them, but because they are undeniable in practice.